The Trill killer robots smashed through Earth's defense line, slaughtering millions with particle beam cannons, as Earth military leaders screamed at subordinates, rushing to devise any solution to drive back the mechanical horde. 3 days ago, I woke up with a splitting headache in a white, glowing Trill holding cell. My stomach felt like I'd chugged acid. Eyes straining in the harsh light, I spotted a dark, black orb floating on the cell's ceiling, some kind of camera. I pushed myself up and tried to remember how I ended up here. The last memory I had was meeting with High Commander Quasar to negotiate a trade deal on behalf of the Terran Federation. I was the first human to visit Zephyrus, humanity's closest stellar neighbor. The cell door slid open with a hiss, revealing 2 Trill guards with plasma rifles. They grabbed my arms and dragged me down a shining hallway into a black interrogation room, shoving me into a metal chair bolted to the floor. High Commander Quasar stood on the other side of a metal table, eyes glaring. "Stephen Burns, you are hereby under arrest for espionage against the Trill Directorate," Quasar said, voice cold. "What? I'm a diplomat. I have immunity." "What are you talking about?" I yelled. "We discovered encrypted communications you sent back to your leaders. We cracked the code. You have been sharing our technology and defense secrets with your military." "I never sent anything like that. It's a misunderstanding," I pleaded. But I stopped when Quasar pulled out a holopad and played an audio recording. I heard my own voice detailing classified Trill military tech. My mind raced. I had never recorded that. It had to be faked. "Your people have become a threat. You expand too quickly, your technology advances too fast. It is only a matter of time before you turn on us," Quasar said, "so we must act first. We have dispatched a fleet of our most advanced robotic soldiers to your Earth. Even now they approach your homeworld, ready to eliminate your leaders and demolish your defenses. When we are done, humanity will never threaten us again." My blood ran cold. I had to get out of here and warn Earth. But I was the only human on an alien world, and the killer robots were already on their way. The odds were impossible, but I had to try. The survival of the human race hung in the balance. It was time to remind the galaxy why you never bet against humanity, even when we're cornered. I just had to figure out how. Burns squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to focus. He had spent months studying Trill tech. He just needed to remember the vulnerabilities in their security systems. His fingers shaking, he pried open the electronic lock panel by his cell door. Sweat poured down his face as he crossed wires, rerouting power. Finally, the door slid open with a hiss. Burns slipped out of the cell, hugging the walls. He heard boots marching down the hallway. Spotting a ventilation grate, he wrenched it open and crawled inside, pulling it shut behind him just as the guards passed by. The vent was a tight fit. Burns' army crawled forward, trying to keep his breathing silent. As he shimmied through the ducts, he heard voices below. He stopped, straining to listen. "The robot fleet is launching in 1 hour. Humanity won't know what hit them," one guard said. "Doesn't matter. Their defenses are useless against our bots. They're controlled from the central command tower. No way to stop them except shutting that down," the other guard replied. Burns memorized their words. He had to get to that command center. He crawled through the vents until he reached an empty hallway. Dropping down, he crept through the shadows. Alarms started blaring. They must have discovered his empty cell. He picked up his pace, sprinting when he could, ducking into doorways to avoid patrols. Finally, he reached an exit. Sirens wailed behind him as he plunged into the crowded Trill streets. He pulled up his hood, keeping his head down, adopting the quick, purposeful stride of the Trill. His heart pounded as he listened for shouts of guards, but none came. The Resistance headquarters was on the outskirts of the city, hidden in an abandoned warehouse. Burns took a roundabout route, doubling back and turning at random to throw off any tails. He slipped inside the warehouse. Trill Resistance fighters looked up in surprise. "Burns, we thought you'd been captured," one exclaimed. "I was. I escaped. I need your help," Burns said. He quickly explained about the robot fleet and his plan to infiltrate the command center. The Resistance leader shook her head. "That tower is locked down tight. Guards, scanners, automated turrets, you'd never get inside. I have to try. If that fleet reaches Earth, it's all over. Billions will die. The Resistance members looked at each other uneasily. Finally, the leader sighed. Okay, we'll do what we can to help, but I hope you have one hell of a plan, Burns, because right now this is looking impossible. Burns gave her a grim smile. Impossible is what humans do best. Burns knew that impossible odds had never stopped humanity before. He gathered with Xylax and the other Resistance members around a flickering hollow table, determination etched on his face. If we can get someone inside that command center to shut down the robot control system, we might have a chance, Burns said. Xylax nodded. I can create a fake identity in the Trill databases, high-level clearance, all the necessary biometrics, but you'll need to look and act the part. Burns spent the next 2 days in an intensive training program. He practiced Trill mannerisms, perfected his accent, and studied their military protocols until he could recite them in his sleep. The Resistance outfitted him with a perfect replica of a Trill commander's uniform. On the morning of the infiltration, Burns checked his disguise in the mirror one last time. The face looking back at him was unrecognizable, alien. He strode out to meet his team, his posture rigid and authoritative. Commander Zorlak, your transport is ready, Xylax said loudly, as Resistance members bustled around in technician uniforms. Anyone observing would see a senior officer departing for a routine inspection. Burns boarded the small shuttle, his heart pounding beneath his calm exterior. The flight to the command center was short. As he approached the towering structure, he transmitted the codes Xylax had forged. There was a tense pause before the computer chimed an acceptance. Burns exhaled. Inside, Burns marched through the gleaming hallways, other Trill snapping to attention as he passed. So far his disguise was holding, but as he approached the control room, he encountered an unexpected barrier. A shimmering force field blocked the entrance, with a biometric scanner blinking on the wall. Burns' mind raced. His false credentials wouldn't fool this level of security. He needed another way in. Just then, a young Trill technician emerged from a side corridor. Burns flagged him down, modulating his voice to a commanding bark. You there. I need access to the control room now. High Commander Kaiser's orders. The technician hesitated. Sir, I don't have the clearance to... Soldier, are you questioning a direct command from our leader in a time of crisis? Burns snapped, looming over the smaller Trill. Quasar will hear of your insubordination. The technician paled, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his security badge. He swiped it over the scanner and the force field dissipated. Apologies, Commander, I didn't mean... But Burns was already pushing past him into the control room. Banks of computers hummed and blinked around a central holotank displaying Earth. Burns rushed to the nearest console, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls as he accessed the robot command system. Proximity alarms began blaring as he worked to sever the fleet's connection to the central computer. On the holotank, the robot ships winked out one by one as he cut the command links. Burns allowed himself a small smile. He was doing it. Earth would be... Step away from that console, a cold voice commanded. Burns froze, his blood turning to ice as he recognized Quasar's voice. Slowly, he turned. The High Commander stood in the doorway, a plasma rifle leveled at Burns's chest. A dozen armed guards fanned out behind him. Did you really think you could sabotage my plan? Quasar asked, his eyes hard. I knew you'd escaped, and I knew you'd come here. You humans are so predictable. Burns raised his hand slowly, his mind racing. He was out of options. It would take a miracle to get out of this. But then again, if humans were good at anything, it was making their own miracles. He glanced back at the holotank, at the fleet still speeding towards Earth, and... Burns' fingers flew over the console, sweat dripping down his face. He had to work fast. Quasar would burst in any second. A progress bar inched forward on the screen as he uploaded the virus. 95%, 96%. The door to the control room exploded inward. Burns spun around. Quasar stormed in, plasma rifle leveled at Burns's chest. "Step away from that console, human scum," Quasar spat, his eyes burning with rage. Burns slowly raised his hands, but he kept his body blocking the console screen. Just a few more seconds. "Quasar, think about what you're doing," Burns said, his voice steady. "If you start this war, it will be the end of both our peoples." Quasar sneered. "We will be the victors. Humanity is weak." "Strength isn't about weapons, it's about honor, integrity." Burns took a step forward. "Real leaders protect, they don't destroy." For a moment, Quasar wavered. Burns saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Behind him, the console beeped. Upload complete. The virus was spreading. On the holotank, robot ships started winking out. Quasar's head snapped to the display. His eyes widened, then narrowed. "What did you do?" he growled. "I gave you a chance to stop this. You should have taken it." Quasar roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, the command center rocked with an explosion. Alarms blared as the far wall collapsed in a shower of rubble. Xylax burst through the hole, a stolen plasma rifle in her hands. She fired, dropping 2 of Quasar's guards. "Burns, come on!" she yelled over the chaos. Burns leapt for the opening, plasma bolts sizzling past him. He hit the ground rolling and sprinted after Xylax into the smoke-filled corridor. Behind them, Quasar screamed with rage, ordering his men after them. Burns and Xylax raced through the crumbling command center. Explosions shook the building as the resistance attacked from the outside. Debris rained down around them. A bolt from Quasar's rifle seared past Burns' head, close enough to smell his singed hair. They burst out of the building into the open air, gulping down lungfuls of smoke. The resistance fighters provided covering fire as Burns and Xylax sprinted for a waiting hovercraft. They leapt aboard, the engines roaring to life. As they rocketed away from the burning command center, Burns looked back. Quasar stood framed in the doorway, his face twisted with hate. Their eyes met for a split second before the craft accelerated, leaving the High Commander behind. But Burns knew this was far from over. Quasar wouldn't stop until he had his revenge. Earth was safe for now, but the real battle was just beginning. Burns gripped the edge of his seat as the hovercraft wove through the city streets, Trill military vehicles in hot pursuit. Plasma bolts flashed past, exploding into buildings. Civilians screamed and ran for cover. Xylax wrenched the controls, sending the craft into a stomach-churning dive. Xylax wrenched the controls, sending the craft into a stomach-churning dive down a narrow alley as plasma bolts flashed past. Burns gripped his seat, knuckles white, as the hovercraft scraped between buildings, sparks flying. The pursuers fell behind, unable to match Xylax's daring maneuvers. Just as they pulled away, a garbled transmission crackled through the cockpit speakers. Burns leaned forward, straining to make out the words through the static. "Tyoshi, Earth under attack. Robots breached defenses, cities in chaos." Burns' blood ran cold. He looked at Xylax, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. "The robots that launched before we sabotaged the command center. They're already at Earth," Burns said, his voice grim. Xylax nodded tightly. "Stopping the rest of the fleet isn't enough. We have to stop the ones on the ground, too." She toggled the comms, hailing the Resistance's Trill military contacts. A tense conversation in rapid-fire Trill followed, Xylax's face growing more serious with each word. Finally, she turned to Burns. "The killer robots have a fail-safe, a built-in weakness. A specific electromagnetic frequency will trigger their self-destruct." "Great, so we just need to broadcast that frequency." "From Earth," Xylax cut in. "And with the robots attacking, no ship will get through in time." Burns clenched his jaw. "What about the wormhole generator? Your people's experimental tech, could it get me to Earth fast enough?" Xylax hesitated. "Maybe, but it's never been tested on humans. It could kill you." "And if I don't try, the robots will kill billions." Burns met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "I have to do this for Earth." Xylax held his stare for a long moment, then nodded once, For Earth. She veered the hovercraft towards the outskirts of the city, where Burns knew the Trill's most secret research labs were hidden. As they approached the nondescript cluster of buildings, Burns saw squads of resistance fighters taking up defensive positions. Xylax had radioed ahead. They landed on a concealed pad and hurried inside, past security checkpoints now manned by grim-faced resistance members. Descending to the deepest sub-level, they entered a cavernous chamber housing a towering machine, all sleek metal and pulsing conduits. The wormhole generator. Trill scientists swarmed over the machine, making final adjustments. One broke away and hurried over to Burns and Xylax. "We're calibrating the generator for human physiology, but there are still risks," he warned, his eyes serious above his medical mask. "Extreme G-forces, radiation exposure, even temporal displacement. We'll do our best to mitigate the effects, but—" He trailed off. Burns swallowed hard but nodded. "I understand." As the scientist turned away, alarms suddenly blared through the chamber. The main display flashed red, perimeter breach. Xylax swore. "Quasar's forces, they've found us." Burns looked at the wormhole generator, still powering up, then at the fear on the scientists' faces. He squared his shoulders. "How long until it's ready?" he asked. 10 minutes, maybe more," the lead scientist replied, his voice shaking. Burns checked his sidearm, a stolen Trill plasma pistol, fully charged. He looked at Xylax. "Get that generator online. I'll buy you the time you need." Ignoring her protests, he sprinted for the exit. As he ran, he activated his comm. "This is Burns. I need every resistance fighter to the research lab now. Hold the line." He burst into the corridor just as the first of Quasar's troops appeared. Burns threw himself behind a support pillar as plasma bolts filled the air. Leaning out, he returned fire, dropping 2 soldiers. More appeared behind them, a seemingly endless tide of black armor and flashing weapons. Burns gritted his teeth and kept firing, even as the pillar disintegrated around him. Just as he thought he'd be overrun, a battle cry echoed from behind him. The resistance fighters charged into the fray, Trill and human side by side, blasting away at Quasar's forces. Burns joined the counterattack, driving the enemy back meter by bloody meter. The corridor became a smoking, corpse-strewn wasteland. In his earpiece, Xylax's voice crackled. "Generators ready, get back here now." Burns fired a last shot and sprinted for the lab, the resistance covering his retreat. He burst through the doors as Xylax pulled him towards the waiting portal, now a swirling vortex of blinding light. "Remember, activate the frequency as soon as you land," she said, her hand tight on his arm. "And Burns, good luck." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Then, with a last look at the brave men and women holding the line, he leapt into the wormhole. Reality shattered around him, a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shapes. Burns felt himself stretching, compressing, his atoms torn apart and reassembled. He wanted to scream, but had no mouth, no body, no— And then sudden stillness. Burns blinked, found himself standing on a familiar street. Earth. He was home. But there was no time to celebrate, because marching down the ruined avenue, plasma cannons glowing, was a phalanx of Trill killer robots. They turned their skeletal heads towards him, red eyes flashing. Burns grabbed for the electromagnetic emitter on his belt. He had one chance to end this, one chance to save his world. He raised the device, finger hovering over the trigger as the robots opened fire. Burns felt the wormhole generator roar to life around him, the air crackling with energy. The swirling vortex opened before him, a maelstrom of light and power. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his skin tingling as the wormhole enveloped him. Behind him, the lab doors blasted open. Quasar charged in, eyes blazing, rifle raised. He barked orders and his troops fanned out, opening fire on the resistance members at their posts. Xylax dove for cover behind the generator's control panel, plasma bolts sizzling overhead. She typed commands furiously, rerouting power to stabilize the wormhole. The generator groaned, its projectors straining from the firefight's damage. Burns felt himself elongating, stretching, his body becoming a stream of atoms hurtling through space and time. Earth, he thought, have to get to Earth, have to stop the robots. He clung to that singular goal as reality distorted around him. With a blinding flash, Burns materialized in high orbit over the blue-green sphere of Earth. Disoriented, he shook his head, willing his body to resolidify, his mind to clear. Below, he saw explosions peppering the planet's surface, cities burning under the robot assault. He activated his comm. "This is Stephen Burns to Earth Defense Command. Do you read? I have a way to stop the robots." A woman's voice crackled in his ear, tight with tension but infused with steel. "This is Admiral Stark. Burns, you magnificent bastard. I thought we'd lost you. What's this about stopping the bots?" "The Trill robots have a weakness, a kill switch frequency. I'm transmitting it to you now. Broadcast it on every channel, every band, planetary scale. It'll fry those metal monsters." "Received and acknowledged," Stark replied. In the background, Burns heard her snapping orders, the low thrum of the transmission array powering up. Across Earth's surface, speakers blared and comm towers thrummed with the strange alien frequency. At first, nothing happened. Then, a robot froze mid-stride. Another twitched and sparked. One by one, then by the dozen and hundred, the metal killers jerked and collapsed, smoke pouring from their joints as their circuits fried. In city streets and across battlefields, ragged cheers rang out as humanity saw their foe falter. Earth's defenders rallied, pressing the advantage, hope soaring. The tide was turning. But in the ruins of London, one cadre of robots marched on, unaffected. Their leader, a hulking brute of titanium and hatred, signaled its troops. They had adapted, modulating their receptors to screen out the kill switch signal. These robots would not fall so easily. Burns, monitoring from orbit, saw this pocket of resistance and felt dread rise in his throat. The job wasn't done. Those robots had to be stopped, or they could level half the city. And he was the only one who knew their every move, every strength and flaw. He activated his shuttle's controls, plotting a descent vector into the heart of London. The craft shuddered as it knifed down through the atmosphere, heat shields blazing. Through the viewport, Burns saw the robots' plasma cannons flashing, buildings crumbling under their onslaught. Burns clenched his jaw and aimed the shuttle towards the battle-scarred streets. He was the only one who could end this, even if that meant facing those metal monstrosities up close and personal. The shuttle touched down with a bone-rattling jolt. Burns leapt out, plasma rifle in hand, sprinting through rubble-choked streets towards the sound of clanking metal feet and crackling energy weapons. He ducked into the cover of a collapsed storefront as a searing plasma bolt shot past. The robots were close, too close. Burns could feel the heat from their power cores, hear the whir of their merciless targeting systems. He checked his rifle's charge, nearly full. The weapon had been modified by the resistance to fire armor-piercing plasma bursts. Strong, but against these brutes, Burns wasn't sure it would be strong enough. He popped up from cover and fired off a quick burst. The plasma splashed against the lead robot's chest plate, leaving glowing pockmarks but not stopping its advance. It swiveled its cannon towards him, and he dove aside, just as a blast reduced his hiding spot to molten slag. Burns rolled to his feet and sprinted, zigging and zagging as the robot's shots chewed up the pavement around him. He needed to find a weakness, some vulnerability to exploit. But these machines had been designed for one purpose, annihilation, and they were terrifyingly good at their job. He risked a glance over his shoulder, and immediately wished he hadn't. The robots were gaining, their metal claws gouging craters in the street as they bounded after him. Burns recognized their hunting mode, single-minded pursuit until the target was eliminated. And right now, he was the target. Think, Burns, think. He racked his brain, trying to remember every scrap of intel he'd gleaned about the robot's design. The Resistance had smuggled schematics, stolen classified files. There had to be something he could use. And then it hit him. The robot's optic sensors, the glaring red lights on their faceplates. They were shielded against most conventional weapons, but a precise shot with an armor-piercing round might just blind them. Burns whirled, dropping to one knee as he brought his rifle up. The lead robot loomed over him, its cannon glowing as it prepared to fire. Burns sighted down the barrel, aiming for that baleful red eye, and squeezed the trigger. The plasma burst lanced out, a spear of blinding blue-white light. It struck the robot's optic dead center. The red light shattered and the machine staggered, its shot going wide. Burns was already moving, racing past the blinded robot as it flailed and stumbled. One down, but plenty more to go. Burns could hear the others behind him, could practically feel the heat of their cannons on his back. He needed to take them out, fast, or London would be a memory. He spotted a collapsed building ahead, its steel beams jutting out like broken ribs. An idea formed, desperate and reckless, just his style. Burns put on a burst of speed, angling for the wreckage. The robots followed, single-minded in their pursuit. Burns reached the collapsed building and leapt, catching one of the beams. He hauled himself up, scrambling towards the top of the pile. Plasma shots sizzled around him, the robots clambering up in his wake. At the summit, Burns turned to face his pursuers. The machines were close, too close, their metal claws reaching for him. He raised his rifle, not to shoot, but to aim at the beam beneath his feet. The robots lunged. Burns fired. The plasma burst severed the beam, and the entire pile shifted and collapsed, tons of steel and concrete avalanching down. Burns rode the cascade, throwing himself clear at the last moment. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Behind him, the robots disappeared under a tsunami of debris, their frames crushed and mangled. Burns staggered to his feet, breathing hard, and looked back at the destruction. The robots were reduced to scrap, twitching and sparking under the rubble. He allowed himself a grim smile. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done, just like him. He activated his comm. Admiral Stark, Burns here. The remaining bots are scrap. London is clear. I repeat, London is clear. Stark's voice crackled back, exhausted but suffused with relief. Acknowledged, Burns. Damn good work. Reports are coming in from around the globe. The robots are down. We did it. We won. Burns looked out over the battered but unbroken city, listening to the cheers echoing from the streets. Negative, Admiral. Earth won. Humanity won. Never count us out. He closed the comm channel and let out a long, shuddering breath. It was over. The battle was won. But Burns knew this was just the beginning. Quasar was still out there, along with who knew what other threats among the stars. Earth had proven it could defend itself. Now it was time to take the fight to the enemy, to secure humanity's place in the galaxy, once and for all. And Stephen Burns would be leading the charge. He squared his shoulders and strode off through the war-torn streets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The future was waiting, and it was time for Earth to claim its destiny. With a final blast from his plasma rifle, Burns destroyed the last of the killer robots. He stood amid the smoking wreckage, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. His comm crackled to life. "Burns, it's Xylax. We have an emergency." Burns frowned. "What's wrong?" "Quasar, he's gone mad. He's unleashed an orbital bombardment on the capital. He's trying to wipe out the resistance once and for all." Ice flooded Burns' veins. "What? Are you safe?" "For now. But we need to evacuate, and we need your help." Burns hesitated, torn. Earth was safe. His mission was complete. But could he abandon his allies, the ones who had risked everything to help him? He made his choice. "I'm on my way. Hold on." Reactivating the wormhole generator took precious minutes they didn't have. But soon, the swirling vortex opened, and Burns leapt through, hurtling across the light years back to Zephyrus. He emerged into hell. The once gleaming Trill capital was a shattered ruin, buildings crumbling under the relentless bombardment from above. Fires raged out of control, filling the air with choking smoke. Burns raced through the rubble-strewn streets to the Resistance hideout. It was half collapsed, but he found Xylax and the others in the underground bunker, hastily gathering supplies. "The city's evacuation shelters. are already overwhelmed, Zylax said, her face streaked with ash. We have to get as many people out as we can. Burns nodded grimly. I know some old service tunnels from my time undercover. We can use those. They moved out, a ragtag caravan of rebels and refugees, picking their way through the devastated city. Burns and the fighters took point and rear guard, watching for any sign of Quasar's troops. The tunnels were dark and cramped, echoing with the distant thunder of explosions. Progress was slow, agonizingly slow, but bit by bit they made their way towards the outskirts, towards a hidden spaceport and the promise of escape. Then Burns's comm lit up again, an urgent message from a resistance scout. Quasar's ground forces have been deployed. They're sweeping the city looking for us. They'll be on top of our position in minutes. Burns cursed. If those troops found them, pinned them down here, it would be a slaughter. The evacuees would never make it out. He turned to Zylax. Keep moving. Get them to the ships. I'll buy you time. Her eyes widened. What? No, Burns, you can't. I have to. It's the only way. He gripped her shoulder. Get our people out. That's all that matters. He gathered a handful of the best fighters, ones he knew could handle themselves. Then, with a last nod to Zylax, he slipped away, back into the city, back towards the enemy. They emerged onto a debris-choked street, just as the first of Quasar's troops marched into view. Burns and his team opened fire, plasma bolts stitching across the enemy formation. Soldiers fell, but more poured in behind them, returning fire with a vengeance. Burns dove for cover behind a blasted-out ground car. This was it, the final stand. They just needed to hold out long enough for the evac ships to launch. He popped up, sighted, fired. A trooper went down. Burns ducked back as return fire sizzled overhead. The air crackled with the heat of plasma bolts, the street fast becoming a storm of light and fury. Next to him, a resistance fighter cried out and fell, a smoking hole in his chest. Burns gritted his teeth and kept firing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd be damned if he'd let Quasar win, not after everything. His rifle hissed empty. He reached for another charge, and a plasma bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him to the ground. Pain lanced through him, hot and searing. His vision blurred. Through the haze he saw a figure striding forward through the smoke, tall and imperious, eyes cold as the void. Quasar. The Trill leader stood over Burns, his rifle leveled at the human's head. Did you really think you could defy me, Burns, you and your pathetic little band of traitors? Burns glared up at him, defiant to the end. We already did, Quasar. Earth is safe. Your robots are scrap. It's over. No, Quasar snarled. I will not be defeated by the likes of you. If I can't have Earth, then I will settle for the pleasure of watching you die, Burns. He aimed his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. And a plasma bolt hit him square in the back, burning through his armor. Quasar staggered, turned. Zylax stood there, rifle smoking, face set with deadly determination. This is for my people, she said, and fired again. Quasar collapsed, his eyes going dull. Zylax rushed to Burns's side, help him up. I thought I told you to get to the ships, Burns said through gritted teeth. And I thought we agreed, Zylax replied. No one gets left behind. Above them, a deep rumble built, the evac ships lifting off, rising on pillars of fire into the smoke-filled sky, carrying the last survivors of the resistance to safety. Burns watched them go, leaning on Zylax for support. They'd done it. Despite the odds, they'd saved their people, both their peoples. There would be time to rest, to heal. But Burns knew this was only the beginning. Out there among the stars, there would always be new threats, new challenges for humanity and its allies to face. And face them they would, together. Burns and his ragtag team of resistance fighters raced through the rubble-choked streets, plasma rifles gripped tight. They ducked into alleys and side passages, using the city's twisting layout to evade Quasar's forces. Team 1, set charges on that overpass, Burns barked into his comm. Team 2, mines in the plaza, funnel them into the kill zones. Acknowledgements crackled back. The fighters split off, scurrying to their tasks like ants in a disturbed hive. Burns himself headed for a crumbling high-rise, once a gleaming spire of Trill architecture, now a burned-out shell, the perfect sniper's nest. He clambered up debris-strewn stairs, emerging onto a shattered top floor. Broken glass crunched underfoot as he belly-crawled to the edge, unslinging his rifle. Below, Quasar's troops marched down the boulevard, a phalanx of black armor and gleaming weapons. Burns sighted down his scope, crosshairs settling on a squad leader. He breathed out, finger caressing the trigger. Boom! The overpass exploded in a maelstrom of fire and rubble, raining debris onto the enemy formation. Soldiers scattered, shouting in confusion. Burns' rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times. Trill troops crumpled, visors shattered, chests smoldering. More explosions roared from the plaza as the mines detonated, shredding armor and flesh. Fall back to secondary positions. Burns heard Quasar's forces shouting over the comm he'd pilfered off a dead soldier. The Trill were in disarray, their neat formations shattered. Burns allowed himself a grim smile. The plan was working. The spaceport was... A plasma bolt sizzled over his head, close enough to singe his hair. Burns rolled, coming up in a crouch, rifle snapping towards the threat. Quasar stood in the doorway, his own weapon leveled at Burns's chest. The Trill leader's face was a mask of rage. You, he snarled, you've ruined everything. Burns rose slowly, letting his rifle hang from its sling. It doesn't have to be this way, Quasar. There's still a chance for peace. Peace? Quasar spat. After what you've done, your kind are a cancer, a blight on the galaxy. He fired, but Burns was already moving, diving behind a shattered pillar. Concrete exploded, peppering him with stinging fragments. Burns rolled out low, snatching up a jagged shard of rebar. He hurled it at Quasar, forcing the Trill to duck. Burns leapt, tackling Quasar around the waist, driving him back against the wall. They grappled, struggling for leverage. Quasar was stronger, his muscles enhanced by Trill biotech, but Burns was quicker, more agile. He twisted, breaking Quasar's grip, and rammed his knee into the Trill's midsection. Quasar grunted, doubling over. Burns pressed his advantage, raining blows on the Trill's head and shoulders, but Quasar rallied, catching Burns's fist and wrenching it savagely. Burns felt bones crack. He stumbled back, cradling his injured hand. Quasar advanced, wiping purplish blood from his split lip. You fight well for a primate, he sneered, but you're still no match for Trill superiority. Burns straightened, squaring his shoulders. This conflict, it's born of misunderstanding, Quasar. Your people, mine, we're more alike than different. There's so much we could learn from each other if we just tried. Quasar hesitated, his eyes flicking to the devastation below. The hollowed-out buildings, the scorched streets, all the ruin his campaign had wrought. For a heartbeat, his face flickered with something like regret. Burns pressed on. It's not too late. We can still stop this before more lives are lost, on both sides. Quasar's voice was uncertain. He lowered his weapon a fraction. Perhaps you're... A blinding flash, a roar like the world ending. Burns felt himself lifted, flung as if swatted by a giant hand. He slammed into the wall, felt ribs splinter, vision fading. Dimly, through ringing ears, he heard shouting. Xylax's voice, urgent, hands gripping him, pulling him up, the whine of engines. Then darkness took him, and he knew no more. As the last of the evacuees boarded the resistance ships, a klaxon blared through the spaceport. Burns whirled, eyes widening as a massive Trill battleship emerged from the clouds, its hull bristling with weaponry. Quasar, Xylax breathed, her face paling. He survived. The battleship opened fire, lances of plasma slamming into the spaceport. Explosions bloomed, ships erupting into flames. Screams filled the air as the evacuees scrambled for cover. Burns grabbed Xylax's arm. We have to stop him. If that ship keeps firing, none of us are getting out of here alive. How? Xylax demanded. Our weapons can't touch a ship that size. Burns' mind raced. His gaze fell on the wormhole generator, still humming with power. A desperate plan formed. The wormhole. I can use it to jump directly onto Quasar's bridge, take him out from the inside. Xylax stared at him. That's suicide, Burns. The jump could kill you, and even if you make it, Quasar will... What choice do we have? Burns cut her off. If we don't stop him now, we're all dead anyway. Xylax hesitated, then nodded tightly. Okay, but you'll need a way to disable that ship once you're aboard. She hurried to a nearby workbench, hands flying over components. In moments, she held up a makeshift device, wires and circuitry exposed. EMP emitter, she explained. Should fry the battleship's systems, but you'll have to get it onto the bridge. Burns took the device, tucking it into his jacket. He met Xylax's eyes. Get our people out of here. Don't wait for me. She gripped his hand. Give Quasar hell. Burns strode to the wormhole generator, jaw set. He input the battleship's coordinates, praying his hastily calculated trajectory would hit its mark. The generator thrummed, energy building. Burns stepped into the swirling vortex. Reality shattered. The wormhole spat Burns out onto the battleship's bridge in a burst of light and heat. Alarms blared as Trill crewmen whirled in shock. Burns was already moving. He slammed a fist into the nearest crewman's face, dropping him. Shouts rose, weapons being drawn. Burns dove behind a console as plasma bolts scorched the air. Hold your fire, a familiar voice barked. Burns looked up to see Quasar striding forward, eyes blazing. I want him alive. Stand down, Quasar, Burns called, gripping the EMP emitter. It's over. Quasar laughed coldly. You're outnumbered and outgunned, Burns. You've lost. Burns rose slowly, meeting Quasar's gaze. We were wrong about each other, Quasar. Our peoples, we let fear turn us into enemies. Spare me your rhetoric, Quasar sneered. You're a fool if you think... Burns lunged, tackling Quasar. They crashed to the deck, grappling. The EMP emitter skittered across the floor. Burns scrambled for it, but Quasar kicked him backwards. The Trill leader snatched up the emitter. What is this, Burns? Some pathetic attempt at sabotage? Burns pushed himself upright, ribs aching. Last chance, Quasar. Stand down before anyone else gets hurt. Quasar aimed a plasma pistol at Burns' chest. No. You've interfered for the last time, human. His finger tightened on the trigger. Burns tensed, preparing to dodge. A console exploded behind Quasar in a shower of sparks. The lights flickered. More consoles burst, alarms shrieking. The ship shuddered, artificial gravity wavering. Burns lunged, grabbing for the pistol. It discharged into the ceiling as he and Quasar struggled. The EMP emitter, forgotten, rolled underfoot. Burns kicked out, connecting with Quasar's knee. The Trill buckled. Burns wrenched the pistol free, leveling it at Quasar's head. Yield, Burns growled. Your ship is crippled, your weapons offline, it's done. Quasar glared up at him, purple blood leaking from his split lip. The ship groaned and shook around them, systems failing. On the view screen, the Resistance fleet rose from the planet's surface, ships leaping into warp one by one, as they escaped the battleship's range. Burns allowed himself a tight smile. No, Quasar said softly, watching his victory slip away. It can't end like this. All ships stand down, Quasar said into the fleet comm, his voice leaden with defeat. The battle is lost. He met Burns's eyes. You've won, human, this time, but this is far from over. Burns kept the pistol trained on him, unwavering. The Resistance had escaped. His mission was complete. But as he stood on the bridge of the crippled battleship, Quasar's words echoed in his mind. Far from over. Burns had a feeling the Trill leader was right. This was only the beginning. The battleship listed, its engines sputtering. Emergency lights bathed the bridge in an eerie red glow. Quasar's crew, those still standing, looked to their leader uncertainly. Quasar slowly raised his hands. I am prepared to discuss terms of surrender, he said stiffly. Burns didn't lower the pistol. Funny, I wasn't. Quasar's eyes narrowed. You would defy the conventions of war, execute a surrendering adversary. You tried to wipe out my entire species, Burns retorted. I'm thinking the conventions don't really apply here. His finger tightened on the trigger. Quasar tensed. The view screen crackled. A face appeared, fuzzy with static. Burns blinked. It was Admiral Stark. Hold your fire, Burns, she ordered. We're reading massive energy fluctuations from that ship. If its reactor goes critical, the blast could take out half the planet. Burns hesitated. As much as he wanted to end Quasar, he couldn't risk the lives of the Trill civilians below. Slowly he lowered the pistol. Looks like it's your lucky day, Quasar. Quasar's lip curled. This changes nothing. You've won a battle, not the war. Then I guess we'll be seeing each other again real soon, Burns said grimly. He touched a hand to his earpiece. Burns to Fleet Command, 1 to beam out. As the transporter beam took him, Burns locked eyes with Quasar one last time. 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Then Burns was gone, leaving Quasar alone on his burning bridge, defeated but unbroken. Around him the Trill battleship shuddered and groaned, a dying beast bleeding flame and plasma. On the planet below, the Resistance ship streaked away into the stars, carrying the last survivors of a shattered world. Burns materialized on the bridge of the lead ship, exhausted and battered, but alive. Xylax was there, her face breaking into a relieved smile as she saw him. She rushed forward, pulling him into an embrace. "You did it!" she whispered fiercely. "You saved us all!" Burns returned the embrace, feeling the weight of the last few days settling onto his shoulders. The wormhole, the battle, the confrontation with Quasar. It all seemed like a distant dream. But as he looked out the view screen at the stars streaking past, he knew this was only the beginning. Quasar was still out there. The Trill Imperium was still a threat, and Burns had a feeling his role in this war was far from over. He squared his shoulders, feeling the reassuring weight of the pistol at his hip. Whatever came next, he would be ready. Earth was counting on him. The whole damn galaxy was counting on him. It was a heavy burden. But as Burns stood there on the bridge, watching the stars rush by, he felt a smile tug at his lips. Heavy burdens were what humans did best. With a shuddering groan, the Trill battleship's engines died, its weapons falling silent. On the bridge, Burns kept his pistol trained on Quasar, watching the defeated leader closely. Quasar slumped in his command chair, eyes downcast. "Order your forces to stand down," Burns said, his voice hard. "It's over." Quasar's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. He spoke into the fleet comm, his words leaden. "All ships, cease fire. We surrender." On the view screen, the Resistance fleet broke atmosphere, rocketing into the stars. They were battered but unbroken, carrying the last hope of the Trill Resistance. Burns allowed himself a tight smile. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had won. In the days that followed, Burns found himself thrust into a new role, peacemaker. As the hero who had stopped Quasar's genocidal campaign, he was uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between humans and Trill. But it would not be easy. Burns sat at a long table, surrounded by human and Trill diplomats. The room crackled with tension, mistrust etched on every face. "The Trill Imperium has shown its true colors," the human ambassador said, his voice hard. "They cannot be trusted." The Trill diplomat bristled. "Quasar's actions were his own. We cannot be held accountable for the crimes of one madman." Burns raised a hand, silencing the budding argument. "Ambassadors, please. We must focus on the future, not the past. Both our peoples have suffered. The only way forward is together." The talks dragged on for weeks, then months. Progress was painfully slow, every concession hard-fought. Cultural misunderstandings and long-held prejudices threatened to derail the process at every turn. Burns worked tirelessly, shuttling between Earth and Zephyrus, trying to find common ground. He met with leaders, spoke at public forums, did everything he could to foster understanding. But the scars of the conflict ran deep. One evening, as Burns pored over yet another proposed treaty, Xylax entered his quarters. Her face was grave. Burns, I have news. It's about Quasar. Burns looked up, frowning. What about him? He's dead. Suicide in his prison cell. Burns sat back, stunned. He had known Quasar was imprisoned, facing a lifetime for his crimes, but this... He left a note, Xylax continued. He said he couldn't bear the shame of defeat, that he would rather die than live in a world where Trill and humans were equals. Burns closed his eyes, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. Quasar had been a monster, but he had also been a product of his time, his culture. In a way, he had been as much a victim as anyone. Thank you for telling me, Burns said quietly. Years passed. A fragile peace took hold, neither side willing to reignite the conflict. But true cooperation, true understanding remained elusive. Burns, his hair now grey and his face lined, continued his work. But he knew that his dream of a united future might not be realized in his lifetime. One night Burns stood at his window, gazing up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the resistance fleet was still hiding, still fighting for a better tomorrow. Burns thought of all he had seen, all he had done. The battles, the sacrifices, the hard-won victories. It had been a long road, and it was far from over. But as he watched the stars twinkle in the vast emptiness of space, Burns felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the next generation would find a way to break the cycle of fear and mistrust, to build a future where Trill and humans stood side by side as equals. It was a distant dream, Burns knew, but it was a dream worth fighting for, even if he would not live to see it realized. With a sigh, Burns turned from the window, ready to face another day. The road ahead was long, but he would walk it, one step at a time, for the sake of both their worlds. If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, I liked the story, and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.